Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to Cocktails and Rocktails with me, your most notorious groupie, Alice Rouse, author of this little book right here. These other little books. Second book out very, very soon, you guys. I'm a little more than halfway done. Kind of keep changing things up here and there, but I think it's all working out really well. I'm so excited for it. And as always, thank you guys so truly for really giving me a space to feel safe, to feel comfortable, to feel encouraged to even write that same book and a second book, and to really like talk to you guys about subjects and stuff, because there's so many fake creators who don't even do research, who post lies and opinions. That's another episode we're going to get into, though. So just to have people actually, be with creators who are people who are there, who experience things, who have firsthand knowledge, who understand, certain aspects of the celebrity rock and roll lifestyle that most people who report on it never will. It really does mean a lot because we don't get that much attention. So thank you guys for really being here, for really being part of the family, for really bringing attention and just all the amazing things you do into my life that you listen to. I just really can't. Obviously, I have no words because I'm horrible at saying thank you. So thank you guys so much. I love the family we have here more than anything. And more than anything, I like to talk about rock and roll subjects. It's just not always about my own stories. It's about other preconceived notions of society. And we're going to talk about something like that today. And today we are going to have a once a year. This is Founders. KBS, I love this time of year because we have all the once a year beers, once a year flavors coming out. So it's obviously a hobby, not like I'm a drunk or anything. It's like I like to try these new flavors once in a while. And this is the first time I'm trying this one by Founders. They're KBS, hazelnut fudge and imperials soaked in bourbon stout in bourbon barrels. So I'm there. I'm a bitch for the bourbon. You know that. So yeah, we're going to try that today. In another episode, we're going to get into the Goose Island who started the bourbon soak on the stouts. I'm not happy with you. And it's actually an Anheuser-Busch because they bought them out. So the fucking fun-sized Goose Island once a year bourbon county stouts are like this fucking big. They're not even as big as this. Fuck you, Goose Island. Anywho, let's try the KBS. You can tell I'm a little bit sensitive about that size. I like my things big. What can I say, ladies? Even people like, big things. Everybody has preference, and I like my once a year beers bigger than that. So, all right. But let's try the KBS once a year hazelnut fudge soaked in bourbon barrels. Super delicious. Look at that. Look at that nice richness. Oh, I love a good stout. Now, some people will drink this like a little bit above room temperature. I like it a little cold, and to let it get settled in and a little bit less cold because the flavors really open up. So I kind of like to let it breathe. But all right, we're not going to let it breathe. I'm so excited to try this. All right, everybody. Cheers, my dears. Cheers, big ears. Ooh. Okay, that's really smooth because now Rogue does a hazelnut stout that is very delicious, but KBS is a really good stout in itself. So the way they balance the fudge, because the fudge is a different flavor than a chocolate, it's a little bit richer, and that really stands out in this. I'm really enjoying that. I'm going to finish that today. I rarely finish what I'm drinking, but I'm staying home today and finishing that. So let's see, what's the alcohol volume on this? Ooh, 12%. Yeah, I'm staying home. All right, you guys. Speaking of, well, not staying home, but, sometimes we get bored and we scroll through. Oh, everybody say hello to baby Beluga. He's going to go. He usually leaves when I start to film. Don't you, baby? There he goes. But, okay. So, when we peruse comments and Facebook or TikTok or whatever, and certain things always pop up in my mind again and again. And despite the fact that the 70s bitch told me, I'm your elder, you need to respect me. We'll do an episode on that one too. Okay, anyway. But that got me kind of thinking, why is it that the 70s were the pinnacle of rock and roll? Why is it that everybody thinks that even the 70s musicians were so much better than the 80s ones? Because in the 80s, we had so many amazing musicians, guitarists alone, from Eddie Van Halen to not Vinnie Paul, to Dime, to Adrian Vandenberg, to Steve Vai, Randy Rhoads, of course. I mean, there were so many amazing because, you know, just like the guys in the 70s, everybody has their influences. What gets that spark, that G chord that just kind of irps that, and you're just born with the need to play that, and you have the influences, and you can hear the music, and you start to play, because there's some musicians, whether no matter what era they're from, the old blues, from the Robert Johnson era to the 50, to Elvis's musicians, whatever, that are just very, very incredibly talented, that can learn by ear, that just learn by that touch. And I don't think society is offering musicians like that anymore, that just learn with that raw emotion. I mean, because there's just too much available, as to where there was nothing available back then. And one of the things that every generation of musicians does is they're influenced by to be as good as the era before them, as the genres before them, as the years and years, decades before them. But what every era does is surpass. Like, you bet your ass Jimmy Page surpassed, Robert Johnson, or, even B.B. King, as amazing as B.B. King is. Jimmy Page, who else? Why can't I think of great? Because there's so many great guitarists. Jimi Hendrix, Pete Townsend. It was such a different era. There was such a different voice through the music that maybe the eras before them didn't approach, because it wasn't part of their era. So, in a way, I think, like, and the Buddy Hollies, the oh God, who I'm thinking, like, Chuck Berry, stuff like that. I mean, you have guitarists and singers and drummers that are evolving. Even Tony Bennett's drummer, who was an amazing drummer, and I saw him like late 70s probably, playing on a 3/4 piece kit, just rocking his fucking ass out, right? But then Vincent Paul comes along, or Bonham, or Keith Moon, which you're never going to have Bonhams and Keith Moon. And I think Bonham and Keith Moon are the only drummers from that era that could really hold their own in the era that I grew up in, the 80s and 90s, through metal, through thrash, through hardcore, through, speed metal, stuff like that, because it evolved. I mean, it even evolved from Bonham and Moon, Cozy Powell, whoever. It evolved. I think one of the only musicians that evolved their style, their instrument, and their specific area, that would never, no rocker can outdo him to this day, was John Entwistle. I mean, and that's just my bias. I think John Entwistle was just such a virtuoso genius on any instrument he picked up, but especially bass, because let's face it, bass in The Who was the lead guitar. It was lead bass. So I think John Entwistle is the only one that cannot be out surpassed, even though you have Les Claypool, you have Cliff Williams. I think they're amazing bass players, right? Like, Cliff kind of invented a whole different era, and even Robert Trujillo, before he got into Metallica, I think he dumbed himself down for Metallica, but he was a good, really awesome bassist, that a slap bassist, people hadn't really, not a lot of people do slap bass that I've seen, but I think every era surpasses the era before that, because you do have new genres of music coming. You do have these different beats, these different sounds, the different speed of the music. It's like you put up Cemetery Gates to When the Levee Breaks, as far as the drums go, and you're going to hear two great, amazing drummers. But I'm sorry, I think Vincent Paul surpassed his own idols, his own influences, the people that he had, And other drummers as well. I mean, I don't think Tommy Lee is one of the greatest drummers. I don't really see him on the list, even though we don't see Vincent Paul on the list, though he should be there. Of modern drummers, you're still, we're still including the 70s guys because whether they're alive or dead, but I think that the 80s, the 90s really get a bad rap because there were some really great grunge drummers. Like Dave Grohl was a fucking awesome drummer. He really was. Soundgarden's drummer, fucking awesome. You watch these guys play very, very different because I've seen all the different eras, all the different genres playing on stage live. I've watched their techniques. I've stood behind Vin's drum kits and watched everything really happen and hear and watched his feet playing, and Lars Ulrich as well. He may not be one of the best drummers, but he definitely surpassed the majority of drummers in the 70s. And singers have as well because, with the loud howls and the sexy, moans that, like Robert Plant or really just Robert Plant kind of ushered in, and the sexy drawls and stuff. Robert Plant, he keeps modernizing himself. He keeps trying different things. So we're cool with Robert Plant because that's another musician of his time I don't know will be surpassed because, what has Jimmy Page done that's really different? The Firm? Okay. But he doesn't keep the musical journey going like Robert Plant. But really, I mean, I think there's so many more 80s musicians that surpass their own influences from the 70s. And I just don't get it. Like, even especially with lead singers or personas, like you had Jim Morrison, who was just fucked up, died of an OD in a bathtub, right? Just fucked up. He wrote a lot of poetry that was very esoteric, but what did it really mean? Was it just poetic babble? Because I've never really got into the Doors. I mean, like Riders on the Storm, stuff like that, very cool, whatever, but I'm not the biggest fan of the Doors, just like I'm not the biggest fan of Youngblood either. Eka Vandal, that bitch rocks. She's got her own shit going, which I love. But, as far as Jim Morrison goes, okay, great. He's so idolized through mythology. But then again, so is Kurt Cobain. I think Kurt Cobain was a better lead singer and a better lyricist. I think he wrote better songs. They were more raw. They were true to his feelings. They weren't poetic. They were down and fucking dirty, and that needle's shooting up a hot shot. And it affected a generation unlike Jim Morrison ever did. Yes, Jim Morrison reached a certain generation that was budding, but Kurt Cobain reached it raw and created a rawness that was not approached before, I think with lyrics as well, that in the 70s and the 80s, the 70s, they were very, very veiled, like squeeze my lemon till the juice runs down my leg, or very, very much Tolkien, depending on the band, or, I think like Mick Jagger wrote more raw songs, like Brown Sugar and Angie and stuff like that. I think that kind of started becoming a little different as far as lyrics were concerned, because with glam metal, of course, you have, sexy, sexy, fun, fun, chicks and big dicks. Chicks like big dicks, or, I like big tits, whatever. I think that we became a little dirtier, a little more brazen, a little more bold in my generation. Oh, that is good. Look at that color as you're coming. I guess you can't really see it. The light's too bright, but the color is becoming so rich and caramely with the foam. Love it. But okay. So, and like I said, I think that Kurt Cobain, or like even Eddie Vedder, even though we can't understand half of what Eddie Vedder says, Andrew Wood from Mother Love Bone, I think grunge really kind of was the mirror of what Jim Morrison and bands like that with the Doors were doing, but in a very, very different, raw, more thrift store, down in the streets, very, very bold, when the needle's hot and the spoon is sharp, or whatever. When the spoon is hot and the needles, I think it was so much more blatant. And to me, that was part of an amazing evolution from not hiding behind things that the Doors were in their music, or, Led Zeppelin was in their music, and so it was an evolution. Does it make the 70s musicians better than the 80s or 90s ones? No, it doesn't. I think that the world is very, very marketed by movies, like, look at the difference between Rockstar and Almost Famous. The band is so parodied in Rockstar as to where in Almost Famous it's like very handled delicately. You still see the rawness and stuff, but in it's so wrong. It's closer to what life was really like in the 70s and Almost Famous, but Rockstar was so parodied it was like, 500 miles away from what it really was. And because of that, I don't think the musicians of our time get the same credit. Like, Dime, of course, he is an amazing guitar player. He is absolutely top of the top, best of the best, always in the top 10, if not the top 5. But I also think he outplayed Eddie Van Halen, who was one of his own influences that was, more of our time than he was the 70s. And I think that, there's this built-in, marketed, society-imposed hierarchy of rock and roll. Even with the groupies. It's like, why? Why do you think the groupies in the 70s were better? Why did that scamming Les Par say, "You must respect me, I'm your elder"? Funny, honey, I respect elderberry wine more than I do you. Okay? Let's put it that way. Or elderflower liqueur. I don't even like it. But I like it more than I like that. I mean, that was such bullshit. And like I said, it just got me thinking, like, why do we have to? Because there's just so many. I mean, even in the 80s, they outdid the rockers in lifestyle. I mean, if some of the 70s rockers they wouldn't even lasted as long as Jimi Hendrix did. I don't think that Mick Jagger can even keep up with the 80s fucking hedonism. Because we just were like, we were making excuses or saying, I changed the world because I took my birth control in public. No, I think the people marching and sticking flowers and guns, they changed the world. You just enjoyed the perks of all that. And I admit it, we enjoyed the perks of the women that fought for us. And, in the 80s, we were able to live such an open, crazy lifestyle. It was expected of us. So, of course, we were going to live it 10 times better. Of course, the music, being on the road, the family, the life, the craziness, the touring, the machine, it was just so much more insane. There was so much more touring. They were playing 6 shows a week in 7 different states, So, and the musicians were just, they were having to be better. They were having to even better themselves in the 80s, I think. And I think in the 70s, like, there was more competition, as not just for the groupies or Patty, Harrison, Boyd. There wasn't just that kind of competition. It's as the musicians of the 70s started evolving past their idols and their influences, I think they wanted to outdo each other. That's when we started seeing crazy guitar solos and blah, 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 blah. But then you had someone like Steve Vai or Yngwie Malmsteen, who came and took it to a different level and made it scream even louder. Or like Bruce Dickinson, who howled, way crazier than Robert Plant. Robert was more of a scream. Bruce Dickinson was more of a fucking call, a tribal fucking call. It was, I just, I think that society is, like I said, so taught to believe that the influencers the people who influence the musicians, you just can't be better than them. It's against the law. When nature and physics alone, there's always going to be someone. I mean, I think now, like, music, it's really waned. It's there's no creativity, there's no trying to better the person, the genres or the eras before you. There's just trying to be famous a lot of times. Like I said with Youngblood, I'm sorry, I really cannot get into like Youngblood. I think he's being marketed wrong. Like, he's totally talented, and maybe you ought to change out of the fucking leather pants that Jim Morrison been worn since Jim Morrison's Guns N' Roses, Faster Pussycat, fucking The Runaways. Everybody's change your pants once in a while. Don't live the fucking hype, you know? I just don't think there's any creativity that can be surpassed from after our generation. There may be in some ways. I think rap was definitely another era where it evolved, and there you just got, everybody one upped and genres changed and voices became something very, very different. We went from White Lines to Hey Mama to Biggie 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 to NWA. I, again, here we are with the ever evolving, from Digital Underground, and even Tupac evolved past that. So I think that why we should see the absolute talent and coolness and respect the people that influenced before us, absolutely. But are they always going to be the greater musician, the greater songwriter, the greater singer? No, they're not. And I think we're coming to a time that we can actually see that we're not following the rules of marketing and society and what they tell us to believe anymore, especially when it comes to music or movies or things that are heavily marketed in a very, very specific way to subconsciously get us to believe what they're selling. The musicians were amazing, but there were even better musicians, a handful that, just like there was a handful of that era or the era before them, there was a handful that was way better. I mean, like Bobby, what's his butt from Poison, said to me one time, as he smacked my ass because I was showing him my new tattoo. He's like, I always wanted to be a rock star, not the greatest musician. So, and I think a lot of musicians, especially in the 80s glam metal scene, if you've ever watched Decline of Western Civilization, that was the attitude. But you did have that handful of musicians that were either very big, like Adrian Vandenberg or Steve Vai, who still didn't hit the mainstream, maybe like Metallica did, but are still incredibly respected musicians. And I'm sure there's a lot that I'm leaving out, because I know there's a lot of musicians like Jack Knife Lee, absolutely talented guitar player. But he's more known for producing, he's not the well known. Thundercat, incredibly talented bass player, but not mainstream well known, right? So I think there's just a natural evolving that I don't think Jimmy Page is the greatest guitar player in the world anymore. I don't think that John Bonham hasn't been, I think John Bonham has been surpassed by a handful of drummers. I think that, other antics, definitely like offstage antics, were definitely surpassed by all the fucking rock stars in the 80s, because hedonism was a trend. It was just balls out. So, before you put some people on a pedestal while degrading other people, like, oh, Cliff Williams, he never will be better than John Entwistle. I'm biased, what can I say? But, before you start putting the 80s musicians or 90s musicians, because there were some really great grunge musicians. Kim Thale, oh my God, of Soundgarden, love him as a guitar player. So underrated, I think you put him and Jimmy Page on a stage, there's going to be respect, but I just think Kim is so much more of a cerebral, thoughtful, just soul playing musician. Like, he just, somehow his soul, the way he puts his soul into his playing and his cerebral thoughts, his conscious direction. It really is magic for him. And like I said, Les Claypool, great slap bass player, right? Cliff Williams. I wish we could have seen how he would have evolved. But yeah, I mean, I just think that there were some 80s musicians who definitely outdid their influences, just like the 70s outdid some of their, and so on, so on, so on. You know, I think Robert Johnson absolutely outdid Beethoven, you know, or people who came before him. Ooh, because they invented a genre by being curious, by going, whoa, how did this happen? And, you know, we have pedals, and then another underrated guitarist, Scott Dalhover of Dangerous Toys. He's actually a fucking killer guitar player. He can't spell Salt Lake City for shit, but inside joke. But I don't know. I think that a lot of the 80s musicians, because of how parodied it is as a genre, as more of a fucked up, crazy, slutty, derogatory lifestyle, I think a lot of the musicians in the 80s are and 90s are not getting enough credit. Like I said, Vincent Paul, when do you see him on the top 10 drummer lists? You don't. Hell, Zakk Wylde, that scab son of a bitch, is so guilty of stabbing him in the back and dancing on his grave, he can't even say Vincent Paul's name in interviews. So Vinny doesn't even get enough credit as being a fucking killer drummer. And he learned a lot of things and brought a few new things to the table. You know, Dime gets the credit, but does Jackknife Lee? Does Adrian Vandenberg really get that credit? You know, I mean, it's always going to be Jimmy Page, Jimi Hendrix, Keith Richards, you know, Pete Townsend, da-da-da-da-da. I mean, John Entwistle, like I said, always going to be the top. But that's my take on it. I think there were incredible musicians in the 70s, but I think there were definitely some 80s musicians who usurped them in talent and style. So tell me what you guys think down in the comments. Tell me why you think that the 70s musicians always get so put up on the pedestal and given more adoration and credit. You know, yeah, they deserve credit for being incredible musicians and, you know, finding new things, but so do the 80s and 90s musicians. I mean, after that, yeah, I can see where things get stale, sampled, you know, and not just in rock and roll, but in rap, in country, and, you know, everything now is more of a formula rather than a heart and soul. So, yeah, I just think there's a lot of really incredible 80s musicians who definitely outdid, like even Gary Lightbody outdid everybody as a poet and a singer. I think there's more emotion in one of his songs than there are in a few bands' whole categories. You know, Styx, anybody? But all right, you guys, again, tell me what you think down in those comments, and thank you to everybody. Just really, truly, thank you for getting to the end of the episode. Thank you for all the comments. Thank you for the shares, the hypes, everything. You know, I just really, really appreciate it because I know real creators like me who have a real story to tell or a real opinion because of experience. We don't get a lot of traffic. You know, the fake, the AI, the people who abuse their voices to get sensationalized, they get way too much traffic. So follow the real people, follow the smaller creators. We actually have a lot more to say than the same old rehashed. Like if you're on TikTok and you have local places that, you know, people that go to businesses in your city, it's like, oh my God, I've seen that Dutch store 50 times from all these creators who don't do anything original. You know, and then I get onto these people and I'm like, ooh, I'm glad you came across my feed because I haven't seen you doing that before. That's cool. I like that. So spread the word, spread, like I spread my legs in the 80s. Woohoo! And hit that subscribe, hit that share, hit my bells, comment, and we will see you next time on Cocktails Rocktails. Cheers, my dears.